Welcome to The Plunge with Derek Holser, Episode 2 with Mike Di Fuccia, my good friend, philosopher, teacher, spiritual director, begins now. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Mike, for being willing to take the plunge. Let's dive in. And we're back. So, Mike, let's talk about poetic living.
Okay.
Sound good?
Yes.
Sounds good. I want to read an excerpt from your book. This will take a little bit. You know what? I'm going to pull it open to page 101.
Okay.
And this is the start of your chapter entitled Poetic Living.
Okay.
So we've talked about poetic language. Now I want to talk about poetic living. And you have an excerpt from the beginning of The Lord of the Rings. It reads like this. Hobbits are unobtrusive but very ancient people, for they love peace and quiet and good-tilled earth. A well-ordered and well-farmed countryside was their favorite haunt. They do not and did not understand or like machines more complicated than forge bellows, a water mill, or a hand loom, though they were skillful with tools. They were, as a rule, shy of the big folk, as they call us, and now they avoid us with dismay and are becoming hard to find. They possessed from the first the art of disappearing swiftly and silently, when large folk whom they do not wish to meet come blundering by. And this art they may have developed until, to men, it may seem magical. But hobbits have, in fact, never studied magic of any kind, and their elusiveness is due solely to a professional skill that heredity and practice and a close friendship with the earth have rendered inimitable by the bigger and clumsier race. What does this passage represent for you? And I assume it's connected to poetic living.
Yeah, I think when I read that, I don't know when it was, I thought this is how Barfield sees things. This is kind of his critique of our contemporary world, the assumption that the more primitive people were either believed in magic or something, or had
superstition.
Yeah, superstitious or a little stitious, as Michael Scott says. You know, it was kind of this picture of, I think, that framed that chapter a bit. This anxiety about machines, I think, is you can get in Barfield primarily because, as opposed to hand tools, because a hand tool was just a kind of an extension of the self, and one was still close to the natural world. Whereas you can think of a machine as something either doing this work for us and not us going off somewhere else, or like a tractor. A farmer sitting now on top of a tractor, no longer physically engaging with the soil. Yeah, and so all those things, I think, it was a kind of picture of, I think, what Barfield would have thought. Yeah.
That makes sense. So would then the line be drawn between the energy source, because the tractor has a combustion engine and other tools use electricity, or a combination? Yeah. Would that make...
Yeah, I think my sense that it probably had less to do with identifying the source of energy, which actually there could be a good way of putting it, but more the organic versus the dead mechanism. The idea of humans living bios life, working with life, and then there's this intrusion of this thing that's dead, that's intervening between. By dead, I mean not living, not having this teleological drive to do towards a certain end that isn't imposed externally on it. So that's the difference between techne, as Aristotle describes it, technology, and living things. That living things are formally moved towards an end, whereas mechanical things are pushed and pulled towards an end exteriorly. Yeah.
I want to stay here for a second because I'm always fascinated by ideas, which can manifest into ideologies, but also the spectrum along which those ideas can take hold and draw boundaries. Mm-hmm. So, like, the question I ask you is, are we to only get food that we have grown ourselves? And I know that's a completely individual decision. I'm not saying that, but these types of ideas lend themselves to false distinction, in my estimation. Like, who's to say okay, let's take the simple tools. If you have a crowbar that's long enough, you can move a lot. Is the crowbar too long?
Okay.
You know what I'm saying? What are the limits to any
Yeah.
of these things? And it's more just a fanciful question
Yeah.
because I like to poke the bear.
Yeah.
But I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think quantitative difference is one thing. Qualitative difference is
Okay.
something that doesn't blend together. I think that's often a confusion in these conversations, that enough quantitative change translates to qualitative change. So with enough mechanism, you might be able to get life all of a sudden. That all of a sudden something organic would emerge from something material. That distinction, in my view, as a philosopher, reality would have to change for that to happen. Maybe my mind is too narrow, but there's nothing in reality that tells me that that distinction will be like crossed, if that makes sense. That more quantitative, faster, stronger, longer crowbar, all of a sudden the crowbar is giving birth to other crowbars and then running around having conversation. Like, that's a qualitative difference. It's not a quantitative difference. And that would be the same between a living kind of thing in a mechanism. Like the tractor will never beget other tractors. It will never be like, man, I don't feel like doing this anymore, or be intrinsically motivated. It will always be a slave to our whatever we tell it to do. Yeah, it won't have its own interior compass. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's go into an area neither of us are informed enough to speculate on, with the rise of what's known as artificial intelligence.
Yeah.
And now the actual reality that you can have computer write code so the programmer is replaced by a computer. It could be labeled as self-replicating in a way.
Yeah.
Any thoughts on that?
I still think you'll never get a computer to be conscious in the way that, like, it's only conscious because we say it is. If you remove the human from that idea, it's not to say that it doesn't replicate what we do, it doesn't replicate the way even the mind works and all of that, but it doesn't have its own intrinsic formal cause to it. Everything it does is imposed from the outside. That doesn't mean that it doesn't move on its own. It doesn't mean it doesn't, like, there's a lot of things that move on. Tractors can move on their own. It doesn't mean it's not amazingly sophisticated and it won't do incredible things, but it's not living. I suppose that would be the difference. It relies on human beings, essentially, to even, it will never have an awareness of what it's doing. It won't have a self. It won't have, I know that a lot of people would completely disagree with me on that, but I think, like, reality would have to change for that to be.
Yeah.
And I will go all the way back to Aristotle's distinction between techne and physis. If you want to read more on that, read Aristotle. In the Metaphysics, and I think in De Anima, he goes into these kinds of things, but that's what I'm basing it on. Maybe you would call me old-fashioned for doing that. It's not an account or a critique of technology. It's to me, a critique of a philosophy that wants to collapse that distinction. I think there are a lot of analogies between that distinction. There are a lot of analogies between the way that AI works and the way that our minds work, but I don't think you can collapse that distinction by having a more sophisticated mechanism.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, let me go back to the Hobbit lifestyle. So we're in the Shire, the sun is shining, the flowers are blooming, and we're tilling our little patch of ground. As we've progressed and modernized, right, all of those vestiges of days gone by in which every individual basically manufactured every element of their life, right? I think we saw specialization rising coming out of the Middle Ages. I'm sure it predated that, but we now outsource everything primarily. And my question is, as the rise of this operating system and technological innovation begins to overtake service skills, my own vocation, historically, I was an attorney. It won't be long before artificial intelligence can replicate the majority of that work. Let's just talk about poetic living as in the midst of this kind of disruption.
I don't know what Barfield would think about that and what I would respond or how I would respond to that with the little thought I've given to it. I wouldn't say it has anything to do with what Barfield would think about this. But I think what he was concerned with was not the technology, it was its impact upon humans. That's all. In the question of whether it was the philosophies or narratives that were driving the technology that were more sinister, like as they redounded back on humans, not not because technology in and of itself or technological advancement in and of itself. I think there was concern with maybe like the dehumanizing tendencies of it in someone like Barfield, who they saw the Industrial Revolution happen. The other thing, of course, for him that stands out in Barfield's fiction work is the ecological concerns that come with this. That was his biggest concern. Then the next one would have been, well, I think second to that would have been like mental illness and like the kind of things that we're seeing today, and the loss of meaning and these kinds of things. In other words, like the same ideologies that were driving technological progress were just becoming part of the fabric of the way that we as humans lived and related to things. Yeah. I think he did see this idea that machines intervening wouldn't be healthy for us. But I don't know, again, like today, I think he was concerned about what he would call abstraction. The idea that we were getting further and further away from the natural order and that technology is kind of an intervention in that. And so this is why this kind of hobbit lifestyle to him, or the kind of primitive reflected at fonder time, I think for him, again, his idea of where we should head though had to do with taking all that skill and the technological prowess, but maybe tempering it, or maybe making sure that the spiritual side of us was being nourished at the same time. That would be the concern. For some reason, there seemed to be a correlation between our ability to manipulate things and create things and this kind of loss of the spiritual origins of a person. That concern, and I think that's still a concern with people that are into philosophies of technology and stuff like that. If there's any pushback, it's usually not the technology itself. They see the good in that. What they're concerned about is why there's this correlation between that and what at least appears to be materialism, the rise of materialism, the rise of stuff, the rise of like accumulating more things, that sense of unmooring people are living with today. I don't know if that's been made sense of truly, though. It could be that technology is being blamed for something that it has no
connection to.
No
I mean, I think it's pretty evident in the history of warfare, technology and weaponry. Sure, right?
Yeah.
So if you start at the very base level of hand-to-hand combat, that's an incredibly intimate experience and requires a lot of either passion, rage, something overriding your basic humanity to seek to inflict punishment with your bare hands. Yeah. And then, of course, using part of the earth that's around you, a rock or whatever, right? But progressing to being able to wield a knife, to then a gun, the distance between the human and the other human continues to extract, to use that word you've used before, until you now have a guy at a computer terminal controlling a drone.
I shouldn't be laughing.
Right? That can
it's
obliterate.
It's very personalized, right?
Completely.
This is the concern. This is also why language becomes important here. If you've ever listened to like military people talk about killing somebody, they don't say I killed a person. Right. They say what's the language they use? The target, or I mean, I'm not military, but they'll never say I shot a person.
And it's not that particular soldier's choice to use that word.
Yeah, exactly. So you change the language. I think this is the concern about humans being technologized and being spoken of as mechanisms.
Well, I think of collateral damage instead of
a bunch of
30
people
dead humans.
Yeah, because you bombed so-and-so and it just so happened to kill a bunch of innocent people. Yeah, so that language, that methodology that's being applied to a science to create AI or anything, great. My mentor at University of Nottingham, Connor Cunningham, used to call it like the universal acid. Like it leaks out of the laboratory of science, and then it becomes like a way of describing everything. It's when a methodology, again, becomes an ontology. I think that's the concern.
Very interesting.
Like it then has to describe, because we figured out AI, the human brain then becomes that. It's not that the AI is modeled after the human brain. Now the brain is being modeled off the metaphors we're using for. Like we say, I don't have bandwidth for that. So it's redounded back. That's the kind of danger when it becomes like, no, it's analogous to the way our mind works. So much of it looks similar. We could even find
neural networks.
Yeah, that's all of that. Like there's nothing wrong with the idea that our neurology is creating a certain kind of response, and there's a mechanism. Our bodies are mechanistic in that way. But it's different from saying that you can give an entire account of the human person because you've described how the mechanism works. Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So with our poetic living, and I'm particularly drawn to the notion of peace, and I seek peace. I am pretty publicly opposed to military intervention and action. And so I'm curious about how we, in our spheres of influence, direct our language, and even would it be that as a poetic liver, someone who's living poetically, that we would be corrective in language. So as we just described, the terminology that becomes associated with certain activities, because if we articulate truly what happened, it would reduce our tendencies to participate in it. So we create, each thing has its own jargon that we use to make it more palatable.
Yeah.
And so would it be then maybe that's the nature of resistance activity universally, is that you confront the reality of the language as it's being used. And
it's kind of like a nonviolent resistance or something.
Yeah. Well, I just mean like in a conversation, rather than adopting the terminology that perpetuates it.
Yeah.
As someone who's attempting to live poetically, would you, should I be intentional to arrest that, if my friends use that word? You see what I'm saying?
It's almost like confrontation. Do I confront this?
Correct.
Or do I just use the
swim
language?
in the
or use my own language as in response. The idea of living poetically, at least as I understood it, is Barfield says at one point, and I think it's in a series of essays called The Rediscovery of Meaning and Other Essays, which means one of the essays is called The Rediscovery of Meaning. But somewhere in that collection, he says that all of his thought can be broken up into what he calls aesthetic participation, which is like the perceptions we have of things, the way we relate to things, and then sociological participation. My book is split in those
aesthetic and sociological.
Yeah, I mean, like one's perceptive, the other one is actually it's lived out. The way we perceive things is actually we live that out. And for him, it just means we want to not be so individualistic. Might be a best way to describe it. So in our interactions with people, we want to be more peaceable between one another. Again, it's not me over and against the competition. The idea of an economy set up based on competition would probably cause some anxiety that we're not individuals in competition. We want to be more careful about that. Yeah, so I guess it's being aware of the language we're using. Honestly, I've never thought about this, but being more aware of the language that we're using about ourselves, about how we go about. But I think it also has to do with, again, we come back to like what is driving my life. If economic concerns are my primary concern, the language I am going to use about my time, the language I'm going to use about myself, productivity, management, these kind of things, I could begin to ignore parts of myself that require a more spiritual kind of well-being, and ignore that for the sake of, again, becoming a kind of mechanism that just fits within in the world. I like the book called Leisure, the Basis of Culture by Joseph Pieper, who talks about how to maybe integrate the world of action and contemplation, the world of life and of doing, with these more non-utilitarian ways of being. Like we always think everything we have to do has to have a return on investment or whatever, where the liberal arts are literally the fundamental, and we're seeing the decline of the liberal arts. Like it's crazy what's happening because there's no return on investment with those.
Right.
Like you can't, but the liberal arts are literally established for the idea that they're good in and of themselves to learn, to acquire virtue. It's not because I can sell it or I can, and this is why Plato is so critical of, well, Socrates of the sophists, because they claim to sell wisdom. They had something that other people didn't have access to. Where the liberal arts is something we can all access, we can all gain, we can all grow in, but they're not useful in the sense of, like building something or whatever it is. They might not have a return on investment.
Sure.
And that's again, a sign of the times, I think.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we could go down an entire separate episode regarding the debasement of the currency and government guaranteed student loans, which has led to rampant educational
which I don't blame parents for being like, I'm not sending you to school, paying all this money for. So you're exactly right.
The comparison and contrast of the opportunity cost for a baby boomer graduating from college relative to what they could what they would be paid, what their degree cost, what housing cost, all of those sort of typical, as you described earlier, that American dream vision relative to the millennial generation is night and day. I mean, it roughly equates, I believe, the base median salary in the 70s. I think the cost of a house was like about 3 times.
I remember seeing
what that would be. So it would take 3 years' salary to buy a home.
Yeah.
And it would be 8 to 9 times today.
Yeah.
Depending on where you lived,
Yeah,
it could be
yeah.
more. Like we're in such a location recording today on the central coast of California. Absolutely stunning.
Yeah.
I love it here.
But I might be homeless next year.
Yeah. But all of that, though, is connected to the poetic language and living. And you talk about how underneath it all, that the dynamics that are driving culture are, again, comfort and material accumulation, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's manifested in just dollars in the bank account, but what those can acquire for me in the material world.
Yeah, and that book Barfield would connect that to idolatry. I think any Christian would too, and that is it's like kind of in my DNA, like for some reason, and it's very hard to imagine shifting to something like, I don't know, again, like acquiring virtue. Like I would like to acquire virtue.
Well, if it's okay, we can cut this if not, but I'd love to go get personal because
it's personal.
Yeah. You and your wife lived in a hermitage for a year, roughly, maybe a little more, in Big Sur. And that is an intentional, more monastic existence.
Yeah.
Can you tell me about that experience, how that might connect to what we're talking about?
Yeah, I think I always say this to people. A lot of people think that my wife and I live a life of simplicity, like intentionally. I'm not sure that's really the case. I think it's been circumstantially, but nonetheless, so we have had a lot of experience living simply. To go to the Hermitage had to do with a couple, answering questions, like internal questions about way of life, about the relationship between prayer and work and those kinds of things. And I think the idea of living simply, is very appealing to me. Like I'm reading Walden right now, and that's like my dream. I don't know if I'm a Luddite or it's escape, or I'm actually the truth is I'm trying to beat the system. Like, I'm not going to make it like everybody else did. So I'm like, how can I beat the system? So I'll just live in a really small place, have my own piece of land, save some money. It's sadly driven by that. But there's also a kind of novelty. Like, I can work with my hands. I can actually do those kinds of things. So it's always been a kind of bucket list thing. But the experience at the Hermitage, we were living in a 300 square foot cabin.
Yeah, talk practically about it.
It was literally off the grid, but we had this crazy view of the ocean. So the Hermitage is powered by diesel generators, have been grandfathered into the California system because that's not a real good thing. But they're working on getting a solar system to power the whole thing, because it's literally up a mountain in Big Sur, which is one of the most remote areas of the country, I came to learn. And so we were off that grid even. So we were far enough on the property, but away from where you could get electrical lines out to us. So we were one of the only cabins that was on solar power.
So you were in a 300 square foot cabin.
Yeah, heated by wood stove, no air conditioning, which mostly was fine. There was a few times in the summer that it was really awful. But for the most part, you're fine as long as you have heat. The stove would go out every single night to wake up freezing. The temperatures would alternate like crazy. Then we got these terrible rains and the firewood soaking wet. I mean, it's not glorious in any way. I was also working full time, doing the same job I do now. And speaking of technology, the only way we were able to do that is because the Tesla Starlink had come to that area that they could use it. And so I bought a Starlink, which allowed me to literally work out of that cabin. Yeah. It's crazy. And because the Hermitage, they have the satellite internet. They've gotten Starlink since, but their phone lines are literally satellite lines. I've never heard. I don't even know what that means. But they weren't good anyway. And so we were evacuated because of the slides. There was significant slides, and those who know this area know that those slides have, since there's been another slide, they've repaired a major slide. You can't get from the north in the Monterey area, Carmel area, south to where we are on the Central Coast, directly on the beautiful Highway 1 right now. We don't know when it's going to be repaired. This happened, and so we got evacuated and didn't have a timeline of when we could return. So it was only a year we lived there. I think we would have stayed longer, but we kind of felt like the upheaval of it all with no timeline. When I reflect on our time there, I think my wife and I have had, hers is more of a story of surrender because you run into like nature there. You don't have the conveniences of, and it was like, you can try all you want to, yes, you're in a smaller thing, but control your, she would say that her biggest lesson there was just literally surrendering to God. And she would say like literally the day after she surrendered, we got evacuated. So she was like, okay, what is all this? For me, I thought that life would be so pure and holy because we would do the hours with the monks. I volunteered on staff. She actually
So you went
worked.
to a prayer session every day?
Yeah,
There's
at least
monks
twice
there.
a day.
Twice a
They
day.
pray 4 times a day, mass once a day. And we interacted with a lot of them. We still are very close with them. And I volunteered 10 hours a week on the maintenance crew with the guys up there. There was a gardener up there as well, female. And I think what I took away from it was like, it had nothing to do with the simplicity. I mean, that's hard. It's hard to live that way. Like, it's not a novelty. Like, you see van lifers or these things, like, they're not showing you what that's actually like going to the bathroom in a Planet Fitness. I mean, come on. Like, it's just not, there's nothing cute about it. But the struggle was real, man. And like, I would walk just to the church and I would have these birds just all over my sock. There was never a comfortable moment there. And I started to think about how people went into the desert to cloister from like the culture, this concern with culture in the early years of Christianity. And that it was such a testing thing for me because my piety, that it's really popular in Christian circles right now to have like a rule of life and to have margin. You hear all these trendy words. And if you can just carve that out, nobody can, no one in the real world can live that way. It's usually just wealthy people that have the time to do that. Like most people do not have the time to do that. And what I found was that's what I thought was going to happen when I went to the Hermitage. I'll just be this holy man.
Sure.
And really, it was a way of just controlling my spirituality. That's what I wanted. I wanted more control over my spiritual life. Like, if I can just have this space, it was nothing like that. It was finding out that, like, I was the worst human being on earth. All of those frustrations and things that I couldn't control, it was like me finding out the angry person inside of me because I wasn't getting my way because there were stones in my shoes. Or I had to hike out to get my laundry and, like, petty little things that I'd secured, all this kind of false security I'd created, this false internal piety. Dude, the moment I was put in a difficult situation, the monster like inside of me just came out. I was like, okay. So now I'm very suspicious of the idea of creating a kind of spirituality that is retreat-based. Even though we have ministry stuff that we do this with, it's important to do all that. Don't get me wrong.
Right.
Like, it's a good first start to be like, I work too much. My life is out of control. I haven't even attended to my interior life.
Right.
It's a great first step.
It's not a cure-all.
No. I think it's a good basis for figuring out who I really am. And this is why it's so important that Christians actually go to church. They actually engage with people. We actually get in the dirty, because as soon as we're put in those situations, that's when we find out who we really are. And you can do the formation stuff all on your own and never ever be challenged to like the integrity of the kind of person that we are. So that's what the Hermitage did for me. It just showed like who I really was. And I can remember like walking from it was quite a hike, and sometimes it would be hot to get from like the church back to our cabin. And like, even if it was bringing food back and forth, the power going out constantly because we didn't have enough solar power. We needed to order new batteries, and I'd be hooking that up in the middle of the night. The alarm on the solar power would be going out because the refrigerator is plugged in. I mean, you find out who you really are when all the conveniences of life were stripped away. And I just know now that I live a very nerf life. Like, I know that the life I'm living right now, there's no spiritual progress in that at all. I mean, there's very little when you're not stripped of like
struggle
things.
And hardship is essential for spiritual.
Unfortunately, in my case, it has always been suffering. It's always been the only kind of experiences that I grow in. If I create a world around me that I want, and that involves being very nice and like praying every morning and like going to church and not stealing, like, maybe not smoking, or maybe not drinking too much alcohol. That hasn't done anything for me. In fact, I can get really comfortable in that. I always say this. unfortunately for me, the only growth in my life has come through those kinds of experiences, like difficulty, even suffering. Yeah. I'm not saying it's that way for everybody, but yeah.
It's very interesting. So two thoughts. The first is, of course, the solar panel alarm went off in the middle of the night. I mean, it's just like the smoke detectors in our house.
Yeah.
It's always
like
2 in the morning.
It's like Lord of the Flies when something like that happens and we're losing sleep.
Right.
And I mean, I've had people who tell me having a baby wake you up in the middle of the night is like insanity. Like if they're crying and you can't get them back. It's kind of like people experience that in their normal lives, but I hadn't.
Sleep is essential. The other thing, though, that comes to mind as you describe the method and the path to spiritual progress is how interesting it is. On the one hand, both you and I like to exercise. And particularly lift weights. How we actually embrace that physical tension. There's soreness. There's right, but we know the other side of it. And yet, very few people in life gladly and vigorously embrace the kind of struggle you're describing, even though the same growth is awaiting on the other side.
It's interesting that by unknowingly putting myself in an unstable situation created internal stability for me. I don't know if we should, I mean, there's this idea of aestheticism where we have to be careful here.
Sure.
Like you just mutilate yourself.
I'm not whipping my back.
Yeah, like for the good of God. I think this has to happen by grace sometimes, unfortunately by things out of our control. But I think it has more to do with that, the sense of learning to surrender the will. And I think a lot of times even our vocational aspirations are about moving on from something that we should be dealing with.
Interesting.
In saying like, oh, that's not God's plan for my life. And so I'm going to go over here to this more comfortable space. And we just continue to ascend and never have to, if we're skilled and sophisticated, we never have to deal with those parts of us that when we're put in dynamics at work or whatever that, and again, maybe God can be mediated through these difficult circumstances that we would rather kind of shut down to.
Interesting. Very interesting. Thank you for sharing that, for real.
Yeah. It's a fun experience.
I remember a number of times Zooming, we were on Zoom with a few guys and you had your Starlink up on the hillside.
It's crazy. The first time I visited, I tried to work and we have a camper van and we drove it there for 2 months. I mean, you know this. And they didn't have any of that internet. So I would have to drive all the way to Carmel to do work. It was crazy. And so when we thought of living there, we were like, we can't. But Starlink had come in the following year, and that's how we were able to go there. I actually had someone they already had it there. I was like, you need to call me on a Zoom call. I need to know that this thing works. And it did. It works incredibly well. Yeah.
Fascinating that in the end, perhaps Starlink will return us to our agrarian roots.
There we go. Hey, we can all live off grid now. We can work off grid. Yeah.
Okay. Last question on poetic living. Yeah. It seems as though a key feature of poetic living is that it refutes the modern idea that being, and this is a quote, enlightened, logical, civilized, and or scientific is superior to the magical, illogical, uncivilized, unscientific mind of the primitive. Could you elaborate?
Yeah, I think what I found in Owen Barfield and the conclusion I've come to is that Barfield is not wanting to prioritize one way over the other as much as he's wanting to say that the two of these need to be integrated. So poetic for him means the integration of what we might often think of poetic versus philosophical. He sees that the two of these should kind of be integrated in this way. It's not so much that he prefers the kind of primitive life over against the civilized life, although there are times where it really sounds like he does, frankly. I think he's more interested in how those aren't meant to be seen over and against each other, that even as civilized as we feel today, those are just our perceptions of things. We're still a lot more in desire, maybe, these kinds of things than we think we do. But that doesn't mean we need to reject like advancement and all this and then go back to like a kind of nostalgia. A lot of people who have, like John Milbank in particular, or maybe even someone like Charles Taylor, who've pointed out these genealogies or these intellectual histories, or the history of ideas, how perceptions change over time. But a lot of people have been critical of them for being nostalgic. I do think it's not that. It's that we want to recover what we've lost and bring it forward. It's not so much, no, we need to go back to like primitive times or something like that. Now, again, people may disagree with me or think otherwise, but my sense, how can you have this view of final participation that says we take all this technological prowess, this ability to work with the material world, this categorization, but we marry it with this vision? And all of Barfield's fiction, to me, is about that. Is about this future stage. We've kind of got lost in this material dwelling, these perceptions of materiality. We've kind of destroyed to recover the earth, to recover the creation. We need to, again, bring forward our kind of like spiritual origins. Yeah.
Interesting, because I think there could be some evidence for that even right now in the rise of things like social benefit corporations.
Okay.
Companies, probably the one everyone's most familiar with is Tom's, the shoes.
Yeah.
Where they give a pair
exactly.
back.
Yeah.
Far more awareness in our capitalist society, and whether or not it is altruistic or simply calculated because that's the zeitgeist, but it is a reality that there is now expected a social component, whether it be companies that plant trees.
Yeah.
I mean, these are now proliferating rapidly.
Yeah.
As maybe evidence to the conclusion beginning of to use Steiner's term, of an epoch. I don't know if this would qualify. Move back toward, and in fact, my wife just messaged me this morning because we've had a lot of conversations. As you know me, anybody that knows me, I'm fascinated by cultural shifts and trends. And I don't even think the word is trends. I think it is cycles. And there was several books that influenced my thinking in these lines. The first being Generations by Strauss and Howe, written in the early 90s. That traces the influence and effect of each generation on successive generations and in a 4-generation cycle pattern in American history. But also their book more recently, The Fourth Turning, which attempts to describe the period we're currently living through, this disruptive transition, demographically, technologically, politically, socially. But then, in addition to that, a book I read recently, The Storm Before the Calm, which again articulates a prediction that in the 20s, we will see a rise and return to larger families, more communal gatherings. And my wife sent me this message. I'll just share it because it's germane to what we're talking about here. I think it really is an indicator of poetic living. And it is, she saw this post, I don't know what, it's from FT Weekend, you know, both our wives with Instagram, who knows?
You never
There's
know.
always some animal.
My wife refers to her as her algorithm. My algorithm is not helping me today.
Yeah.
I'm like, oh God.
Well, ours are, like monkeys playing with.
Oh, which I love that.
Yeah. But this is the articulation at the bottom connects to this. A new wave of Gen Z-focused supper clubs are popping up across London as 20-somethings increasingly turn away from sticky dance floors, bars, and dating apps.
Yeah.
Those building a following, such as Tuesday with the number 2, the Candid Club, because, why spell it right when you can make it cool with using a number for a letter? Anyway, the Candid Club and Dinner for 100 bring young strangers together through an almost century-old social dining tradition. Now, as the stay-at-home generation ditch clubbing, 3 nightclubs have closed each week in the UK since the start of 2024 and are increasingly health-conscious. Supper clubs are again gaining in popularity, particularly with graduates of COVID-area university cohorts who seek alternative ways to socialize away from partying. I think that's an indicator.
Yeah.
It's one anecdote, but it's certainly a greater likelihood than there has been in the last 20 years that people are desperate for that meaningful connection.
Yeah. I think I remember that article you sent me a long time ago, Behold the Millennial Nuns. And I think it's connected to that idea that, at least I think that we've lived out this idea of what we call negative freedom, the idea that one becomes more free and flourishing to the extent that there are no limitations on my freedom of will. That you can't be in relationship. You can't actually live in relationship that way.
Yeah.
And I do think that has a huge contribution to the isolation that people feel. And maybe we're beginning to realize, like, to be in relationships, we have to be able to not always get our way. We have to, like, make compromises. And the Millennial Nuns article had to do with women feeling like no one was telling them anything of what to do with their life. Like, the future, all possibility, right? It's just only possibility.
Well, what do you want to do?
Yeah, what do you want? But to have an actual form for them to step into, that's what the article was, that younger females were becoming interested in becoming monastics because there was actually a rule of life to live by. And I think this is why this is trendy in Christian circles, because for a long time, particularly in Protestantism, you could just be a Christian and never go to church or never actually have any affiliation with a way of life or anything like that. And giving some type of structure, like, again, a form to something that we can step into, like music we talked about, I think that is more closer to the human heart and to more healthy relations between people.
That's good. All right, let's turn to poetic theology.
Okay.
And this is, as you talked about the monastic and the rise in this is our final segment. My first question is, you quote Soren Kierkegaard in the opening to chapter 5, Poetic Theology. And I'm not in any way a Kierkegaard expert, but he seems to be one of the most profound thinkers of the last few hundred years, certainly.
Yeah.
His quote is, "Modern philosophy makes no movement. As a rule, it makes only commotion. And if it makes any movement at all, it is always within immanence, whereas repetition is and remains a transcendent."
Yeah.
I'm an outsider. How would you explain
I
this?
kind of wish you wouldn't have asked me that. No, this harps back to something earlier in the conversation where we talked about how creativity unfolds through repetition. And Kierkegaard's critique and that quote has to do with, again, the idea that mere repetition and repeating of something can become kind of dead and stuck. He also has this connected to a larger metaphysic of, it's a Platonic thing, that all the world, when we talked about the trees and the oaks, like, if the world is repeated non-identically all the time, then to do philosophy, it can't be, this is kind of his critique of Kant, it can't be repetitive, kind of back to the thing we talked about, language. It has to rely on something beyond itself if we're going to get to the truth of things, I suppose is what that really means. It also has to do with how people form an identity. For him, there's a good book for philosophers called Identity and Repetition that Catherine Pickstock, picking up on what he's talking about, how one forms an identity through these patterns. I mean, for me, that was a preface to that chapter that fits with, I think, Barfield's idea of how this kind of way of being, a way of life that is most conducive to kind of like our humanity, has to do with drawing on inspiration and things that lie outside of maybe our mere philosophical capacities to something like poetry, and draws us ultimately, for me, to something like liturgy. That's a lot, and that's a very dense quote and has a lot of meaning.
But I think it's helpful framing because we're and yes, it is. It's very dense. I'm not discounting that. But the topic being poetic theology.
Yeah.
You mentioned liturgy.
Yeah.
The repetition.
Yes.
Is there a reintegration in Barfield, or your take on Barfield, that poetic theology is such a thing?
Yeah. So this is all of this chapter is really, for me, it's informed by Catherine Pickstock's work. It's called After Writing.
She's in the UK?
Yeah, she's the Norse Hulse Professor of Divinity at Cambridge now. She wasn't when I knew. She was my reader for my dissertation, which means she's the one who's most critiquing it, that you're kind of doing your defense against. It was very much, this entire project in some ways was shaped by her book called After Writing. And the subtitle was On the Liturgical Consummation of Philosophy.
Wow.
And so I saw in Barfield and that's where that quote again picks up. We did talk about that earlier, the repetition of liturgy done well lifts us beyond that mere repetition. And I mean, Kierkegaard's not saying that, but it's a philosophy that lends itself to that for sure, in my opinion. And so this chapter, this idea that, again, I'm in this chapter moving beyond Barfield. He's not a theologian, but what I'm saying is implicit in his philosophy, in the way that he thinks, it's pointing to this kind of thing, whether he was intentionally doing that or not. I mean, there are more obvious links in something like, again, that article on the Trinity. I can't remember what it's called or where it is. It was written much later, like maybe in the 80s he wrote it. He was older. The unancestral voice kind of touches upon these kinds of things. And there are other times when he talks about the Logos and participating that this becomes. So in Barfield, you see he wants to establish this spiritual connection horizontally to the world, but he doesn't see that uncoupled from the vertical connection with some. He uses the language of Logos, but he does get Trinitarian later in life about this. He becomes a Christian in, like, I think the fees. And again, in these later articles, you can see him kind of working with more Trinitarian language. I think with Aquinas' view on words, how words are conceived, how that harps back analogously to the creation story. And all this, God speaking things into existence, these kinds of things. And he sees that when humans use words, proper creativity is kind of participating in that. I mean, to the point where, like, for him, when we name something or say what something is, to the extent that we do that well, we're actually seeing something beyond what's actually there. I've seen some people think that this is panpsychism, where the idea that the mind kind of, like, is creating these things. I don't think Barfield is really saying that. I think he's saying that we have this ability to see beyond the material of things. We can see the inside of things. And to the extent that we're open to the Creator, we have more of a kind of ability to do that. Sometimes it sounds a bit Gnostic, but
I love the title of Pickstock's book. So as I would take away from that after writing, right? So the liturgical end is essentially these processes are beneficial of philosophy, of writing, of articulation, but their ultimate and highest good and end would be
praise. Like a return of the gift, like this idea that it's our way of returning the gift back to God, the gift of creation, what we see around us, the way we articulate these things. And she opens that. I mean, it's been like literally over 10 years since I've read that, but the term after writing has to do with in the Phaedrus, that there's this.
What's the Phaedrus?
It's a book by Plato.
Okay.
And in the Phaedrus, the orator is like reciting words that he has written down somewhere else.
Okay.
In other words, in the conversation with Socrates is whether this is actually inspired or not. So like anyone can be a kind of orator, but it was the one. So it's after writing.
And can
like
memorize
once you kind of like write
Yeah.
something down that you've inspired to write, it kind of kills it. And it can be repeated, but it's not the same thing as the original kind of inspiration.
That's fair.
And she's touching on that Platonic element of a muse. And
Yeah.
she was really into this concept of the middle voice, which I talk a lot about in end my book with, that it's this kind of like space that's not me projecting something onto the world or me just passively receiving what the world is, but it's all like proper language is this inspired kind of like muse that comes upon.
Yeah.
And this ties into the idea of participation with God and grace, even the idea that our nature is perfected in grace. And the Greek has a middle voice. Like I think like there's one Scandinavian language that has it right now. I could again, but we don't have a middle voice anymore. We have active and passive. Either I'm doing something to something or it's coming upon me. So if you think of language that way, either I'm just merely articulating it and it's just coming purely from subjectivity, or it's an objective language where I'm just simply mirroring what I see in representation out there.
What would middle voice do?
It would be somewhere in the middle where like when I'm actually articulating this thing is a kind of inspired utterance that moves beyond the object. And so this concept of polarity in Barfield that he gets from Coleridge, who we haven't talked about, he's obsessed with this idea of polarity, this tension between subject and object. And he goes into great excavation of all the marginalia and everything you can find with Coleridge to find the origins of this, and he never does because he never read the opus maximum. I don't think he ever did.
Barfield never.
He never got it. There's this big controversy about like when the collected works of Coleridge were being edited. He was very frustrated that for some reason he never got to read that. The irony here, I wrote an article on this. The irony of all this is that in the
Coleridge was 7. Correct?
No, 1800s.
Okay.
Hundreds. The irony here is that the origins of polarity, that Barfield has spent his in the book called What Coleridge Thought. That's all Barfield cares about, is where does this concept come from? It comes from Aristotle, who Barfield is critical of.
Gotcha.
And it comes from the act potency distinction that we talked about earlier, which I think if Barfield would have seen that, it would have clicked for him. But anyway.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Well, as you were talking about the difference between something written down and something inspired, as we describe it, I think about a music concert versus a recording.
Okay.
And this is very a personal thing. I'll make sure my daughter's cool with me sharing it. So my kids are now, this year, my oldest will turn 22, my middle is 20, and my youngest will turn 18. And when
you must have had them when you were...
Yeah. Oh, yeah. It was. I'm surprised you didn't see. It was all over People magazine. 10-year-old fathers' children. Anyway, that maybe National Enquirer. That doesn't exist, I don't think, anymore.
Unfortunately, we have other fake.
I have not
sources.
done a lot of tabloid shopping ever in my life, but I'll jump on Reddit and see what I can find. So when they were little, this would be like preteen, teen years. They had an iPod Shuffle. And there were some, parent-approved albums on there. And one of them was Coldplay, Viva La Vida, the title track.
Okay.
But she listened to that on repeat all the time as a little girl. And about 3 years ago, Coldplay came to Seattle. And we went to the concert and took her. And when the first note of that song hit, she began to weep. And, I'm getting emotional thinking of seeing her in that space, because it was like so many times she had heard this replication of it, but she was experiencing the reality of it. Wow. And it was overwhelming. And I don't know, I feel like that's kind of what we're talking about as we describe these experiences.
It's language. Like a duplicate versus like the real thing. And again, a sign is good because it, these are the writing becomes a sign, or the song, the recording becomes a sign of these. But then in reality, that's a great example of a concert. It's just they're actually there and they're actually singing in real time. And I think that's very at the heart of what this is about.
And I guess I would say potentially what we're talking about with poetic theology to liturgy, that, as you described, going to church, doing liturgical activities are the instantiation, embodiment of these things that we profess.
It's our effort, not earning, but it's our effort that we put in. Like spirituality is the same way. Like there's a middle that we're all kind of after, and that middle for me is some kind of effort. Like a friend who says, my God is a God of effort. Like when I take a step forward, it doesn't mean I'm going in the right direction, but I had the courage to do it, and this is what I thought was best. But if I just sit back and do nothing, or I overexert myself, then I'm trying to earn. I might be trying to earn. And so effort, this is Dallas Willard makes some kind of distinction. He said that grace is not opposed to effort, it's opposed to earning, is what he says. So,
Okay. You mentioned Trinitarian. The idea of the Trinity is foundational to Christianity. Indeed, it may be the most distinctive feature of the faith. What does Barfield make of the Trinity, and how is it essential to his expression?
I wouldn't say it's essential for him. I think it does later on, like I said in that one article. It does become essential in his understanding of how words are uttered, how they're crafted, how they're reflected. Again, he's drawing on Aquinas to do this, but it really only is there for him to articulate a philosophy of language and utterance and things like that. He becomes a Christian, so he would have been confessing the creeds, and so that makes sense that would fit in. As someone trained in theology, I would be making assumptions or things that I don't know if he would agree with, but I think the idea of all of his work and the idea of final participation is Trinitarian, in that what it's really trying to get to is something like unity and difference. How do these two paradoxical things come to reside? And he does see reality that way, that it's unity and difference, particularly this concept of polarity that he's obsessed with. How does the subject and object relate? He doesn't want to collapse them together. He doesn't want to dualisms. He doesn't like the idea of separating them, but it's a unity and difference that he wants to hold together. How do you articulate symbol and these kinds of things? Well, it's a unity between spirit and matter for him, but it's also, we need to be able to distinguish them. And so he thinks of distinguishing something as a way of like, our minds are gifted to be able to do that. So we can't abstract them in our mind. He wants to be able to distinguish between them, but he doesn't want to divide them. He thinks the idea of dividing the two of them is not actually the way things are, but you can do that with your mind. You can abstract things. And so I think this idea of unity and difference, and then sociologically how we relate to one another, he doesn't think we should return to some idea where I can't tell the difference between a totem and my ancestor, but that these things really do represent something very real about people, that I am a unique person, identity in and of myself, but that isn't necessarily meant I'm distinct from other people, but I'm not divided from them. I'm distinct from, the material world is distinct from the material or the spiritual world, but they're not divided. So that Trinitarian, I don't think he doesn't ever say anything like this, but as someone who's read some theology, that's probably how I would say the Trinity ends up in kind of the way he sees things.
Perichoresis.
Yeah, I think, again, he wouldn't have that kind of thing, but he would. I think that is what, like, final participation is something like that for him, a more peaceable existence, an exchange of value as much as things, an exchange of pleasantries, an exchange of love, seeing the economy more based in terms of gift giving being beyond mere monetary value, calculation, those kinds of things, which he sees in that kind of like the Hobbit kind of world.
Well, I guess I would say, hopefully tying some threads together, if the Trinity is a real thing, right? As Christians, that's the belief. But going back to your earlier point in terms of the origin, your grandmother's blanket. So the origin has a purpose and end unto itself.
Yeah.
And final participation, you've said that multiple times. Then, therefore, the Trinity, the perichoresis, being the originator and the telos.
There is in Christian aesthetics or philosophical theologians who talk about the creation returning to its origin. I mean, and that's what you're describing here. At the fullness of time, that's what it's going to be, that it returns to its origin. That I guess metaphorically, we could see that, or in reality, we can see that as, again, this more peaceable existence between people that were, I'm sure we'd love to see today.
I think not only peaceable, but harmonious in the end.
Yeah, and this is why Augustine writes, I don't think it's ever been translated out of Latin, the Consensus Musicus, where he describes creation in terms of musical notes. And you can even have disharmony occasionally, like people make mistakes, but there's this kind of underlying form towards which this culmination the music is moving towards. In that disharmony that may feel like or evil or things that seem like they don't fit within this will be gathered up to this kind of like composition and this final kind of reality that we're moving towards, but we can't quite make sense of how that disharmony fits right now. And then you have these individual notes that together compose this musical score that we're all singing, I suppose, right now, or playing.
The symphony is unfolding, and hopefully we believe that the crescendo will be transcendent.
And there's a reason then for great hope. And I think one of the things that has separated John Milbank, although he can be very critical of the way things are going, he's always had a very hopeful voice that Christianity is here. It's not going anywhere. While things may look pretty dire, there is a very, if you have that view, it's one of hope. Yeah.
Okay, just a couple questions left. Barfield is careful to distinguish between the divine and human word. How would he do this, and what can we learn from this distinction?
Okay.
Welcome to the Actors Studio.
I think that he knows this distinction between the two. He wouldn't want to confuse the distinct. There's an article or a book that I think it's called Owen Barfield on C.S. Lewis, that you can learn a lot about what their interactions and what they thought. I think it's in that book where he very clearly articulates knowledge of what theologians call the creator distinction. Like, you don't ever want to collapse that. And it's like, my sense is that feeds into his understanding of God in the way God speaks, and then the way in which we might participate in that as human beings, in that language, in that living, in that way of being. But I suppose that quote there makes me think of, he knows that you don't collapse that distinction, between creation and God into a kind of like, our words are divine or something like that,
Yeah.
where something I say could literally be from the mouth of God. It would be kind of heretical for one thing, but it doesn't mean it's utterly like univocal to what God is saying about things. In the book, I talk a lot about, in this chapter, analogy, because that was trendy. I don't know if it still is in Catholic and Protestant dialogue, particularly in the 20th century, in how that becomes a way of a language that avoids the idea that my voice or my being is univocal to God's, like the same. Like when I say something, I'm merely just repeating what God told me. It's a direct kind of transmission, or the way I see things is exactly the way God sees them. See a kind of idolatry here. And then the other option of this was equivocal language, like when I say that God is my, like a father, or I call him father, that's in no way related. So when I use the word father to describe like my father, or univocal would be God is father, it's because he's exactly like there's so many, like it's called natural theology, where we take from like our example of father and we read that up to God. Theology has always been very careful of avoiding those two extremes. That has fundamentally to do with the distinction between the creature and the creator. How do you say that God is creating, sustaining, upholding all things without collapsing into kind of pantheism or even a panentheism that doesn't recognize that distinction? So that feeds into language. It feeds into his idea of the distinction between the divine logos and like our participation in that. I think it's really good theology, what he's doing. Yeah. Even if he doesn't even isn't being intentional about it.
There's continuity between the two.
Yeah. And that's why I think part of the movement I fell into, the radical orthodoxy stream, was really going back to the Middle Ages and saying this divorce between philosophy and theology was unneeded. It was forced almost. It was a kind of intentional bracketing like we talked about earlier. But in Barfield, what I really saw was, if you just do philosophy and you don't try to, if you're more open to like, it's going to lead you to this more transcendent vision of things. It's not going to give you Trinitarianism and all this stuff, but it is going to say like, that makes sense.
Right.
Like, now that makes sense to me, rather than just kind of thinking of philosophy as something one does without any help from beyond it.
Interesting.
So he had this very openness to like, and it comes from Steiner, it comes from reading Coleridge, to something beyond unancestral is what he calls
unancestral.
it. Yeah.
That's an interesting word.
Yeah.
So,
the unancestral voice. That to him is this thing that we're all kind of tapping into.
So it's not in our genealogy. Is that what the unancestry, like it's real or it's beyond, but it's not?
I don't know if that's what he means by it, but you can read into, and there's a book called The Unancestral Voice, which is really creative. I think if it's been a while.
Is it Barfield?
It's it's a dialogue, I think. It's like a Platonic dialogue. And this is the one where like he talks about quantum physics. He imagines himself, the character goes and listens to a lecture by a quantum physicist who's like, dude, the physical universe that as we've understood it isn't computing anymore. Like, and so Barfield's like, of course it isn't. Like, he's loving it. So he was really into quantum physics.
Interesting.
Yeah.
I'll need to
keep going.
Yeah.
It's crazy the span of things he caught. That's what was so hard to say, like, where do you focus with him? Because he's involved in language, anthropology, and sociology, and philosophy, theology, economics, college, fiction, nonfiction. It's crazy. History, different languages, cultures.
Yeah. It's interesting because, as you articulated earlier, like kind of that polymath, the days gone by, the Renaissance people, like they were versed in, because this is pre-specialization. Hyper-specialization probably is what would be a better term. Yeah. Interesting. Okay. Last two questions. Where and to what extent would you say Barfield's ideas diverge from or even contradict Orthodox Christianity?
I think it's been settled amongst Orthodox Christians that we don't believe in reincarnation. I don't think Barfield ever sheds that idea. Maybe the preexistence of the soul.
We probably should have led with that one. That'd probably
Yeah.
So Barfield believed in reincarnation. In what regard. Like,
he believed in reincarnation. I mean, he
like-
believed that the soul was kind of eternal.
so
I mean,
it just
cyclical.
cycles.
Yeah, I think so.
Any
But
connection to like families or just
I don't
is
remember. To be
pure-
honest,
a
don't
big
know
lottery
well
system
enough.
up in the sky.
I don't know well enough. But this is Plato.
That's not
believes this.
outside the bounds. of
Plato
many
believes this.
thinkers.
In Oregon, like you get this
Yeah.
in his stuff, and so yeah, it's not out. I think it's outside of the bounds of.
Yeah, I think there's
The
nothing-
reason why is that like souls, if they're eternal, it collapses the creature-creator distinction.
I see.
In philosophically, that becomes a bit tricky. Now, someone who's more sophisticated than I am may say, no, there's ways around that, or that's how I see it. Like when Plato gives his account of the origins of reality, he talks in the Timaeus about the force that moves form and matter. With Aristotle, it's the unmoved mover. And these all come into play into the Christian. So there's a bit of it there, but what Christianity in the Incarnation does is it really does establish the difference between a transcendent other God, but yet is nearer to us than we are to ourselves. It's a very, in some ways, that's the scandal of the whole thing.
Sure.
The metaphysical scandal of it. But yeah, I don't know if there's anything else. I think some people may be like, oh, you haven't read him, or maybe more suspicious. I don't think, I mean, you could say, yeah, I don't really know. Like, of course, he has some unique readings of the Jewish people. Like, it can be a bit esoteric at times, but I don't think there's anything outside of that I would locate, unless I'm just, not aware.
Well, I mean, I think reincarnation is enough of an outlier. to-
Yeah, I think it is.
to-
I think that's
to
the
be
one thing that
controversial.
would definitely scare Christians from reading him. You know, why he's been kind of left off of the Inklings
Yeah.
kind of hagiography might have something to do with this stuff. I think there are other reasons, political reasons behind the scenes that I've heard of that I probably shouldn't mention.
That's too
about
bad.
dynamics between, I think we could talk off camera about dynamics between Lewis's family and then the estate and things like that,
Yeah.
that might have helped create that distance. I don't think there was any like between Barfield and Barfield was the estate holder and Lewis's wishes when he passed away because he was a lawyer. Barfield was a lawyer.
Yeah.
Good company.
Well, it's fascinating because I think about that so often with genius, transcendent artist or great work. They know that they're not the generator of it. They're the conduit of it.
Yeah, that's a good language, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And so, like, I love Rick Rubin's book, The Creative Act, A Way of Being.
Yeah.
Rick Rubin's,
Yeah.
and he talks about the source.
That's
say God.
similar to what Barfield's talking about. It's the same kind of
well,
thing.
to your point about possible disagreements or squabbles among heirs and successors to these works, is that it's typically held loosely by the creator, but it is grabbed onto tightly by the successors for multiple reasons. Part of it is, I think, keeping alive the genius that is so close to them, but they were never able to embody themselves, right? But also, obviously, financial gain. That
that always gets all of us in trouble.
It's back to that again.
But I think your point about the inspiration and creativity, that's what Barfield, I think, would mean by the middle voice. You're doing it, but you're inspired. I remember Catherine saying that Paul's language in the New Testament for prayer often appeared in the middle voice. So it's kind of inspired, but we're still doing it. Exactly like a muse comes up, the language of a muse or something beyond ourselves.
It's funny because, to be personal, I've written poetry my whole life, but of late, I thought about how often when I share with my friends and family and general, the public through Substack, like, is there an element of that in which, as I reflect on my own motivations, is there anything that's self-promotion? But I really can honestly say I don't think of it, and I didn't have words when I was younger, but today I think it's pretty clear to me. I'm not writing it, I'm discovering it. And when I discover it, I'm excited to share it with the people I
that's
know.
a gift. That's how you give a gift back. Like, it's a gift to you, you share it. I read somewhere that it wasn't until Shakespeare that people started putting names on stuff.
Interesting.
Because they could sell it, like they could reproduce it. And I don't know how true that is, but like to your point, the inspired person, the moment, I was just talking to a musician about this, like how aware of you are when you're writing or inspired, are you of the people this is going to.
Right.
And I imagine initially you're not really, but then it becomes like, oh, I want to share this.
Yeah.
And because if it's like a lot of people who have hobbies like baking or something, and they go and they become a professional baker, and then they're just upset because everyone has an opinion about how they should do it.
Right.
Rather than just, it was so much more liberating just to do the craft on your own. Yeah.
Totally.
Yeah.
When we monetize things.
Yeah,
just
it gets everything has to be monetized though. Like, no, it doesn't. I mean, that's how it feels.
Yeah. Oh, Mike, I've had a blast.
Yeah, it's been awesome.
It's so cool. Any final thoughts on Barfield's life significance to
Yeah.
this point, but also to the future, what he might mean?
Yeah, I haven't recently spent a ton of time reflecting on Barfield, so this has been really cool for me. Thank you for like humoring me again to kind of like think through these things. That, like, I guess my hope with someone like Barfield is that, I mean, most people I don't think can read Barfield. You have to have like some type of philosophical background. His stuff is not easy to read, but I hope that, you know, in studying him, it kind of trickles down the importance of this kind of reality of life, of these poetic dimensions we've talked about, are really important for like our human well-being, in a way to balance again the tendencies that are all around us. I think he offers a proper perspective that isn't really doing away with that. Yeah, so that's, I think, what I think we can take away from him. Yeah.
Cool.
Yeah. Thank you. It's been amazing.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Today's episode of The Plunge is sponsored by the word exemplar. Exemplar, E-X-E-M-P-L-A-R. Exemplar. An exemplar is a person or thing which serves as an excellent model, a standard that we ascribe, a standard that we seek to reach, right? An exemplar. It's also a copy of a book or writing, but in our usage and for our purposes, we are talking about the meaning of the word as a good example. Isn't that something that we all would like more of? But I think so often, at least in my life, I look beyond myself for examples instead of building an example within myself. I find that attempting to be an exemplar, of course, having discovered exemplars from history, from culture, from holy texts, I have been inspired from fiction. Great stories are full of exemplars. In fact, it's our literature that might be the source of some of the greatest and most enduring exemplars that we have. Do two things this month or this year. Find a book with a great exemplar, and then be an exemplar to yourself, to your friends, to your family, to your neighbors, to the world at large. It starts within. Thank you, Exemplar, for sponsoring today's episode of The Plunge.